Boker Tov, Chaverim, and welcome to another episode of Heartfelt Haftarah. Today we are going to be focusing on the Haftarah for Toldot, our sixth Torah portion found in the book of Genesis. It's the Torah portion that begins with moving a little beyond the narrative of Abraham and Sarah, and we're going to start to explore our ancestor Yitzhak and the transition from one generation to another, and the appearance of the twins, that is Jacob and Esau. But before we go there, it's time for tent peg business, explaining what we know about the prophets and understanding them in their literary and historical contexts. So I never figure out a good place to put this while I'm doing tent peg presentations, but here it is. Okay. So the thing we're going to talk about today is that our Haftarah comes from a minor prophet. And just to review, because I'm sure I've mentioned it before, there are major, maybe I haven't. I'm not sure. We've only done 6 of these. I might not have. Okay, so let's talk about major and minor prophets. So a major prophet is simply known as a major prophet because of the sheer size. And we have 3 major prophets. We have Isaiah, the longest, Jeremiah, the second longest. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, and Ezekiel, the third longest. I actually know what I'm talking about. And then we have 12 minor prophets. And the scale of their books is so small by comparison that, in fact, all 12 of the minor prophets are written on a single scroll, as compared to having to have a single scroll for each one of the major prophetic books. So that gives you an idea how relatively small each one of them is. That doesn't mean that they're not important. We do not measure the greatness of a prophet on the basis of how much verbiage they produce. So anyway, there are 12 minor prophets. They are also used in our Haftarot. And the minor prophet we're going to be talking about is the last prophet on the end of those 12. That's Malachi. Now, Malachi is effectively an anonymous prophet. No one, as far as we could ever tell, was actually named Malachi. Malachi means my messenger. And so it seems to be an anonymous title. And there is a widely accepted theory among biblical scholars that Malachi actually is the last part of the book of Zechariah. What's going on here? Why would they chunk off a piece of Zechariah in order to create a separate prophet? Well, the evidence for why that is because in the latter part of the book of Zechariah, he adopts a certain form of rhetoric to introduce his oracles, and Malachi continues that rhetorical trope. So it would very logically fit on the end of Zechariah, which doesn't answer the question, why would the authors create, or the scribes? We don't know who did this. The scribes separate it from Zechariah, probably because they wanted the sacred number 12. Jews loved the sacred number 12, and they wanted 12 minor prophets. But apparently, or at least if you accept this theory, there were only 11 minor prophets that were preserved, and therefore to create a 12th, they had to split off a piece from Zechariah to have a 12th. We can discuss whether there's any truth to that or not, or whether that's valid, or are there other equally valid explanations. It's a fascinating discussion in the field of biblical scholarship. Not so important. Just know that Malachi is recognized in our tradition as the last of the minor prophets. The other thing that I need to bring up about this is that we have yet another way to divide the prophets, And that is not former prophets versus latter prophets, not narrative prophets versus literary prophets, but pre-exilic versus post-exilic. What do I mean? Of course, the great defining moment in the foundation of Judaism as we know it today is the fact that the Israelites were carried off into exile in Babylon, and then we were released. Now, prophecy, the vast bulk of what we know as prophecy happened before that exile and seems to be deeply rooted in its relationship to the monarchy. As the now Judeans, soon to be Jews, return to Jerusalem and its surrounding territories, we don't have a king anymore. We're subject to the king of Persia. But there is a final burst of prophecy that happens in this period after we return to Jerusalem. And we can see it most explicitly in the last three minor prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are all recognized to be post-exilic prophets. There's probably an extra one who's snuck in there, and that is the last section of the book of Isaiah. Is so different from everything else that went before it that there is a good argument to be made, especially since it seems to know things. And I know prophets are supposed to know things in advance, but it knows things about the post-exilic world that the earlier Isaiah didn't. So it may be that there was a post-exilic prophet who took on the name of Isaiah and his material got added to the end of Isaiah. But for sure, we have three post-exilic prophets, which are Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah. All right, so I think that's enough for our tent peg. That's plenty of information on that. So let's talk about what Malachi wants to talk about. All right, so the first thing I want to call attention to is the rhetoric that begins this passage, which is Mas Davar Adonai, the burden or the weight of the word of the Lord. And that phrase first starts appearing in Zechariah and then appears several times in Malachi, which is why some scholars think they're connected to each other. But in any case, it is introducing Malachi, my messenger, who has a message for the people Israel, and off he goes. And so, and the thing that he begins with is discussing the ancient tradition of the siblings Jacob and Esau. That connects that this Haftarah to the Torah portion, because in the Torah portion in Toldot, we're talking about the birth of Jacob and Esau, their rivalry, and what becomes of that. And here in Malachi, he alludes to this story of Jacob and Esau and their rivalry in order to make a point. And he begins with an invidious comparison. He says, look at Jacob and Esau are brothers, but I think Jacob's the bee's knees, and I don't particularly like Esau. Now, we have to understand that this has contemporary historical context for Malachi, whoever he is, and that is that the tribe of Edom, that neighbors on the Judeans post-exile, are considered to be the descendants of Esau, and we don't like them. They're mean to us, and we don't want anything to do with them. And so the prophet uses that mood among the Judeans to say, look at who we are. You know, God is every bit as much connected to Esau as he is to Jacob, and yet he loves us more. Think about that. That's really what the prophet is doing. And then the prophet goes on to criticize the practices in the temple. And Here we see the beginning of something that will go on throughout the Second Temple period, all through the return from the Babylonian exile until the Romans destroy the temple, and that is that the temple and its practices are subject to constant criticism and dissension, and how the temple functions is a point of political conflict for the next couple hundred years, 400 years. So that it also introduces another historical contemporary issue that will continue on. So we've heard about the Edomites. We're also hearing about controversies over the temple. But the most fascinating, the absolutely most fascinating part of this Haftarah portion happens in, I think it's verse 11. Let me go look it up. Hold on. Okay. It's already alluded to a little earlier. There's this hint of this idea, but then it's stated out loud in verse 11. That is 111, and that is from the rising of the sun to its setting. My name is great among the nations. Think about that. Malachi is saying that everyone honors God. Now, that doesn't mean the ancient world is any different than we know it to be, which is a world full of pagans, of multi-god pantheons. To the best of our knowledge, the Judahites, the former Israelites, are the only formally monotheistic people in the world, and yet the prophet is saying that God's name is honored all across the world, from the place where the sun rises, which in the ancient world they would imagine to be Persia, India, all the way to where it sets. If they are well informed enough, they know there's a place called Spain, which they call Tarshish, and the sun sets over there. And the prophet is saying that over the entire broad spectrum of the known world, God's name is honored. What can that possibly mean? All right. So, well, the first thing is always remember that monotheism may have developed over time in ancient Israel. And we can see places and prophets and voices who clearly believe that the God of Israel is the only God, but we can also see hints and allegations among the Israelites that many of them were actually still fairly polytheistic. So, and in fact, you can read the Bible as a 1,000-year struggle to get the Israelites and then the Jewish people to accept the idea that there is only one universal God. Malachi clearly believes that, but he's making an extra claim. He's claiming that other nations recognize the God of Israel. How can that be? That defies everything we know about the ancient world. Well, there's a couple of possibilities here. The first one is that Malachi has developed a kind of inclusive, or the prophets who agree with this idea have developed a kind of inclusive monotheism, that even when the pagans think they're worshiping another God, they're really worshiping the God of Israel. They're honoring divinity by different names, but there's only one divinity, and therefore, by default, they're honoring that divinity. So this is a way of thinking about the world that is actually maybe one of the earliest manifestations of religious tolerance. The idea that, yes, we believe there is only one God in heaven and earth. The pagans are in error when they talk about multiple gods, but even they have oftentimes a chief god of their pantheon, or they're simply misconstruing what they're doing. And what they're doing is honoring the one universal God. Now, that's an extraordinary idea right in itself. The other argument that has been made by scholars is that already in the Persian period, we see that the peoples around the Israelites and what would become the Jews, we're transitioning into becoming the Jews, have adopted the name Yud-He Vav-He into their pantheons. So we see, strangely enough, particularly in sources like Greek magical texts, and we're just on the cusp of the Greeks coming into the Near East, we see that the name Yud-He Vav-He, the God of Israel, what would eventually become in English Jehovah, starts popping up in certain inscriptions and texts and things like this. So he gets included along with Isis and Zeus and Horus and Marduk. And so, in fact, he's getting integrated into the multi-god pantheons that are being exchanged as in the increasingly more cosmopolitan ancient Near East. So it could be either of those trends. But what I think is most important for us to see and to appreciate is the idea that this is actually expressing a huge amount of religious tolerance. What Malachi is actually doing is, again, we're talking about invidious comparisons. He started out by talking about the Moabites. God doesn't love them. God loves you. But then his point is all these other people worship the God of Israel. They honor the universal God. And you, Judeans, do not do it properly. It's actually pretty much the same argument that gets made in the book of Jonah, right? That the people of Nineveh, pagans that they are, nevertheless hearken to the voice of God in a way that the Israelites wouldn't. So shame on us. And that's the message. Shame on us that we know God better than anybody, and yet we are the least pious, the least caring, the least capable of honoring divinity. So for the purposes of an invidious comparison, Malachi and the other prophets who adopt this attitude invent religious tolerance. And of course, that's something that becomes an ongoing feature of Jewish life increasingly over time. Were there intolerant Jews in the ancient world and in the medieval world and coming into the modern world? Absolutely. It was a very easy move to say that we have this awesome God and that the rest of you are doing Norschkeit. The gods you worship are not real gods. And yet, embedded into the psyche and into the, shall we call it, theology of Judaism early on is this idea is that the rest of the world doesn't need to become Jewish or adopt the practices of Judaism in order to have a relationship with God. That's something that has proved very useful and distinguishing about Judaism in the centuries that follow, that we become more tolerant than some of the religions that supersede us or come after us. Christianity, really kind of an intolerant attitude. You're either a follower of Jesus or you're damned. Islam, you're either a Muslim or you're outside the pale of believers and presumably damned, though we could discuss that and try and understand what they would mean by that. But it's the Jews who are able to say, you worship God your way, I'll worship God my way, but from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun, God rules us all. And that is revolutionary. And that's an incredible feature of our Haftarah this week. So I'm glad to be able to share that with you, and I look forward to joining you next week.